Right, well, we're over 200 people, so I'll kick things off by saying welcome to everyone and good afternoon. I'm delighted that we've got so many people signed up for this afternoon's event. I think it just shows how important it is as an issue. I'm really delighted to have not only David Lammy, who's of course the key person with us today, but also an incredibly expert and interesting panel. My name is Rod Clark. I'm Chief Executive of Prisoners Education Trust, and that's a small charity that works to support prisoner access to education in prisons. And the specific service that we provide is funding prisoners. But to move on to today's event, 3 years ago, the Lammy Review was published, and that was an incredibly important landmark review highlighting the institutional racial disparities in really all aspects of the criminal justice system, from policing, the courts, through to prisons and so on. And 3 years on, those injustices are still around. And we want to look at the continuing need for change in the criminal justice system. And particularly our interest is in highlighting the link between those disparities and what's happening in education. We know that there are racial disparities that also persist in the education system, and we'll hear a bit more about that later. But at PT, we're particularly interested in getting more into this topic, and in particularly exploring what research there is and looking to do more around the relationship between prison education and racial disparities. We're hoping that today's conversation can be a starting point, and we would love to hear from you about any thoughts you've got about ideas about how we can explore that further. Now, the schedule for today is that we're going to be hearing from David Lammy in conversation with our chair, Dr. Angela Herbert, and then we'll move on to our panel who all present, and then there'll be a Q&A. Can I just say a couple of words about how Zoom is going to work? It's in webinar mode for today, which means that you can only see the panelists that are available on the screen. And because there are so many hundred of us that we can't all be talking at once, we'll need to ask you to use the chat function if you want to make any kind of general points or for discussion, or to share reflections, comments and ideas. When it comes to the Q&A, if you look at your menu at the bottom, you'll see that there is a specific Q&A function. So when it comes to asking questions, if you could click on that and use that to ask the questions, so that it makes it easier for Angela and the panelists to see the questions in amongst all the chat that might be going on. Can I also say that we are recording this webinar? So if you ask a question, your name might be read out during the Q&A, although I think you may well find that you have an option of making your question anonymous if you prefer. So what I'll do now is just quickly hand over to Angela, who really is I can't think of anyone better qualified to chair today's session. I mean, she's an educationalist with a whole host of degrees, including a doctorate in education, and tremendous experience of the prison system, starting as a volunteer a good few years ago as a volunteer prison tutor, but then also working as head of learning and skills in prisons, and then also in headquarters in both in education and family policy. She's also had an enduring interest in equality, diversity and inclusion in the criminal justice system, and chairs a violent crime prevention board and a Metropolitan Police independent advisory group in London. She's the director of Inside Out Solutions, which provides training for practitioners in this area. And finally, if that's not enough, she's also been a long-standing and very valued friend for Prisoners Education Trust. So, Angela, please can I hand over to you?
Good evening, good afternoon, Rod, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for that very lovely introduction. And Mr. Lammy, I'm just going to read your bio as well. So the Right Honourable David Lammy MP grew up in Tottenham and was the first Black Briton to attend Harvard Law School. He was called to the bar in 1994, practicing as a barrister before he was elected as MP for Tottenham in 2000. He now serves as Shadow Secretary for Justice and Shadow Lord Chancellor, and has previously held office as the Minister of State for Innovation, Universities and Skills, and as Minister for Culture. He's long been a passionate advocate for reform of our criminal justice system and for action to tackle the disproportionate number of Black people in prison. So good afternoon and welcome, Mr. Lammy.
Hello.
So, I'm sure that people aren't here to see me this afternoon, so I'm going to crack on with some questions, and thank you for being in conversation with me. So I'm sure I can't offer you a cup of tea, so we'll just progress virtually. Imagine that I did that. So, so Mr. Lammy, the Lammy report was not the first that has been commissioned to look at issues such as disproportionality. So my question was, when you were asked by the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, were you optimistic that something different was going to result?
Well, look, I'll be honest, I was very suspicious when I got this call from the then Secretary of State for Justice, Michael Gove, reaching out to me, and David Cameron. I was suspicious because it is unusual in our political system to commission reviews, inquiries by reaching out to someone who is in the opposite political party. But I went for a meeting to listen and to hear. It's important to stress that back in 2015, it was a period where we were sort of in our country, we were into big tent politics. I mean, so much has happened since then, but this is obviously before the Brexit vote. David Cameron had just won his second general election, so it was the end of the coalition government, and he wanted to demonstrate that he had a big tent, and he was bringing in people who were in different political traditions to him to get them to do pieces of work. And Michael Gove was very clear to me. He was serious about this agenda. He'd been to Texas, America, and their Republicans were questioning a bloated federal budget, mass incarceration, issues in the United States. And I guess by reaching across the political divide to ask me to do this, he was putting these issues above the political partisan knockabout. And that's a really important thing. And I thought that was of great value, that if you like, we would get this cross-party consensus on problems of disproportionality in the criminal justice system. I asked whether it would be properly resourced. They said they would properly resource it, and they did. I asked whether it would be fully independent, and they said that they would allow me to be fully independent. And so I got on with the business of doing the work. I put together an advisory board, again, making sure that it was a cross-party advisory board, Labour people like Keir Starmer, a younger Keir Starmer, long before he became leader of the opposition, but also people like Sean Bailey, who's currently running now to be the Mayor of London against Sadiq Khan, on the group to look at these issues, and we reported in good faith. And I was obviously very pleased that it received, you know, a good response, thorough, evidence-based. And I suppose I was pleased that at that time, it looked like the government would give it a fair win. And, you know, I was privileged to go around the world, and it was the case that in the United States, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, there was a growing cross-party consensus that this was an important issue. Why do our countries overwhelmingly jail minorities disproportionately was the subject, and there was consensus that this was something that needed to be fixed. Very, very sadly, we've moved into slightly different political times. Slightly different is an underestimation, I'm being exempted. And I think some of that cross-party consensus has broken down.
Mr. Lammy, was there anyone in his party that looked like you that might have done this review just at that time?
I mean, I think there were a few individuals, but there weren't the individuals that had the track record of understanding of the criminal justice system. I mean, I've been in and around these issues for 20 years, perhaps also had credibility with communities hugely affected. And I'm well known in Black communities, certainly in this country. And also, you know, someone who probably they could trust to deliver a review. You know, let me be clear, I was delivering a review to David Cameron. I was not delivering a review to Jeremy Corbyn. He welcomed the fact that I'd done the review, but so I deliberately tried to steer the review in a place that I thought would garner cross-party support. So I put in lots of information, for example, about money and finance and the cost of disproportionality, because, you know, there are conservative colleagues and people on the centre-right of the political spectrum who perhaps don't come at this solely through the lens of equality and opportunity, but certainly understand fiscal cost and bloated budgets. And so that was the kind of review I sought to deliver, and I think I probably was the right person in the system to be able to pull that off.
You absolutely were, Mr. Lammy, and the report I have read, not only yours, but a few years earlier, Baroness Young's review.
That's true. I pay tribute to Lola Young, who did a fantastic review just before me, and I obviously built on her work.
Yeah. So at a recent Commons debate, you actually made reference to, like, within 3 years, the increase of people of African heritage. So the numbers have actually gone up as opposed to gone the opposite way. So do you believe that if your recommendations were implemented fully, that could have made a difference?
Look, I think the first thing to say is, when in our country is a country that can move quite slowly. It's a country that's evolutionary, not revolutionary in terms of its history. It's a country that has a tradition when you've got difficult subjects where people don't instantly know the answers, certainly civil servants don't. You ask someone to do a detailed piece of work, you call it a review, you call it an inquiry, particularly if it follows a scandal, a tragedy, a problem. Mine was a review. It didn't follow a scandal like the murder of Stephen Lawrence, but it's a protracted problem that relates to the Macpherson inquiry, of course. And when you ask someone to do that in good faith, it's hugely important that I think that governments get on with implementing the recommendations. In fact, I think in responding to the recommendations, it'd be good if governments went further than the reviewer went. There are areas. I was very concerned with Black, Asian and minority ethnic women in the criminal justice system. I believe that could be a separate report that requires real detailed examination. I think that there are huge concerns in the youth justice system, an area of policy that's not been reformed really since the Blair reforms of 1997. Again, you could do a separate piece of work in that area. A government could go further than I went in my review. I wasn't able to look at the pipeline issues into prison. I did touch on some of them. So, for example, I touched on special educational needs, learning difficulties, huge presentation of these issues in our prison system, certainly not enough triage on entry into the criminal justice system. I raised those issues in my review, but you'll understand that those pipeline issues, who gets excluded from school, who's in receipt of a statement, who is who is not being channeled into the criminal justice system for their offending behaviour, but is being channeled into the mental health, or education system for their offending behaviour. These are really, really important. The care system, these are really, really important pipeline issues. And again, I could have spent more time looking at those issues, and certainly the government could go further than I was able to go in my review in those areas. So absolutely, it's the case that my review was an important starter for 10, and the recommendations need to be implemented. And you will have seen me express disappointment, really, frankly, that the pace of change. So of the 35 recommendations I made on my analysis, about 6 of them have been implemented, another 6 or so partially implemented, and many sort of lie languishing, really, not moving forward and following the spirit of what I've had to say. And of course, it's the case that when I did my review, 41% of young people in our youth offenders institutions were from a black or minority ethnic background. Today, the figure is 51%. That is a staggeringly shameful figure when you consider that ethnic minority populations make up about 14% of the population and about 19% of the youth population. That 51% should be from a black minority or ethnic background is deeply worrying. And of course, what it means is it's very likely that the adult prison population is set to grow as well. Much is said about the United States of America, but it's important to recognize that when you look at the presence of black men, particularly in the system, the overrepresentation in our criminal justice system in the UK is worse, in fact, than in the United States per capita. And there are historic communities like Gypsy Roma Traveller who no one raises any noise about. Indeed, they've not got someone of Gypsy Roma Traveller descent conducting a review into their historic and centuries-old representation in the system. And there's real need for progress and for change.
When I conducted my research, I discovered that even if the population of the prison, as it went up, the population of people that are BAME would increase with it. It would be static, and it is troubling, and it feels almost like, you know, like what's the point? But of course, we're solutions focused, so we're not going to say that. But who is responsible for doing something, or just doing something, making a decision? Because one of your colleagues made reference to there being an ecosystem. One thing fits into the other, not dissimilar to the public health model where everything needs to be connected. Who makes the decision who holds the key to that?
Well, look, let me say that this does take leadership, that my review was across the whole of the criminal justice system. So I had a lot to say about our judiciary and our courts. I had a lot to say about our probation service. Of course, our prisons, I'll come back to that in a second, our youth justice system, our yachts. It was right across the system. Look, I want to say in terms of the prison system particularly, that actually, in a way, the prison system was the bit that gripped my review quite seriously, I think, on the whole. Now, I'm not going to say I'm afraid that there's been tremendous progress, because anyone who's been around prisons for a long time knows that sadly things can move quite slowly in prison settings, and clearly the coronavirus doesn't assist with progress. But it is to say that in terms of some of the issues I raised around leadership in our prisons, some of the issues I raised around recruitment of ethnic minority officers, the issues I raised around conflict management, access to employment, access to education, access to therapy, need for setting the right targets, having the right data. In those areas, I have seen prisons taking this seriously. I've done lots of events, both within prisons before coronavirus and indeed in settings such as this one online. So my sense has been, look, I'm not going to give it 10 out of 10, but my sense has been that the Lammy review agenda has remained on the table. Now, I'd say this also in relation to the prison system. The difficulty is that, you know, in that area, I don't want to pretend that the things that I had to say were new. You know, the Mubarak inquiry also raised some really, really serious issues in the prison system. one of the problems with the system is that it does prioritize self-harm, suicide, worries if there are breakouts, worries if there are issues with unrest in prisons. These are prioritized. These have got the bottom line targets and the KPIs. Race comes and goes. And if you're in the business of prison work, if you're in the business of education in prisons, if you're in the business of managing offenders in a prison environment, you're in the race business. And it's that understanding that I hope my review's really pushing, and that takes leadership. That takes everyone who's in on this meeting at the moment, and it takes leadership right from the top. You're in the race business. Why are you in the race business? Well, look, if you're in the education business, Angela, you know this very well. If you're in the education business in London, you're in the race business. You cannot be an educator in London and not understand issues of race, because all you've got to do is walk into a primary school, walk into a pupil referral unit, walk into a secondary school, walk into one of our universities in London, and you can see you're in a multi-ethnic environment. You've got to understand how to get the most from those ethnic groups in front of you. And you walk into a school and the teacher saying things like, this is what I'm doing with my black boys, this is what I'm doing with my Turkish boys, this is how I found it work with the Bangladeshi community. I'm really concentrated on my white working class boys. I've got them in a breakout group. This is what I'm doing. These are the teachers I'm bringing on. These are the strategies I'm deploying. None of that language is present in the prison system. Yet you are in the same business by virtue of the figures in front of you. You cannot be in the youth offending business with 51% of young people from a black, Asian or minority ethnic background and not be steeped in the language of race and diversity. And that's the message I'd want to get across.
Yeah, I think that also, you know, of late, the, you know, Black Lives Matter and the, you know, the terrible murder that we witnessed, COVID, there are so many issues that actually make it more comfortable to talk about race and actually to explore that. And I think it's important to kind of use that lever. It's a horrible one, but to use that lever and also to then look at what is the purpose of the Lammy Review. How can we use that? So the educationists on the line right now that are working in classrooms, what message, Mr. Lammy, would you give to them to say, this is what you ought to look out for, this is what I expect you to do based on what my study and what my review showed? This is about solutions. This isn't, you know, we've got the problem, but what is the solution that we could present today?
Well, there isn't a single bullet. It would be both futile of me to undermine my review by saying
just to, what is.
But I want the question. I don't worry. I've got the question, but I just want to say that importantly, there are 35 recommendations. Yeah. There could be many more. That the review relates to other reviews like the Angelini review on deaths in police custody, for example, the Macpherson inquiry. You know, there are others. But what I would say is this: that focus on the fact that very, very sadly, the recidivism rate for minorities, particularly the black cohort, black African, black African Caribbean, black British cohort, mixed race cohort, is through the roof. In fact, for black men, it's worse than any other group within the system. So that tells you something about prison not working, frankly, if people are coming back at the rate in which they're coming back. And actually, because of the probation changes a few years ago, those figures have got considerably worse. So what is the intervention that you can make? What is the difference that you are able to make with that individual prisoner, it seems to me? How are you going to ensure they don't return? What is the cultural relevance of what you are teaching them and how you're empowering them? And that starts at the beginning. Why are they here? Is there a pupil referral story? Is there a care system story? Are there issues of drugs, alcohol, anger in the home? What are there profound issues of trauma as a result of growing up, unfortunately, in parts of communities like mine, where that trauma really is about knife crime and gang activity? Have they been pimped effectively by adults to run drugs across the country? And therefore, because those adults have badly let them down, what's their response to you now as the adult in front of them that's meant to be empowering them? You've got to understand all of that business. I was very struck by a young man who, in the prison system, who was talking about the access that he found white prisoners were getting to therapy. I'm, by the way, hugely impressed by therapeutic prisons. I wish there were more in our system, but therapy can play a real role for having prisoners who are ready, confront what they've been up to and what they've done, and go back and reform. And this prisoner said, look, when the white guy cuts his wrists or, you know, threatens to kill himself, he gets to see the shrink, he gets all the support, blah, blah, blah. When I do the same, I get nothing. And I said, really? I can't believe it. What do you mean when you do the same, you get nothing? That cannot be right. And he said, well, look, I punched the wall the other day. My hand was set in plaster. I broke some bones. But that wasn't seen as self-harm. It was seen as violence. And I got nothing. And it reminds you of the language around it. We're developing, aren't we, an understanding that young women who have been abused, who have been pimped, and sometimes have not been seen as victims, the system needs to change to understand that they are victims. Similarly, the system needs to understand, to change and step back from some of the stereotypes it's deployed in relation to some of these ethnic minority prisoners. And it's once you're getting around that you can really make a difference with education. Understanding that access to education, access to things like ROTL, day release, employment, so that you can get that job when you leave, are really, really important. One thing I haven't mentioned that I raised in my review, in fact, on Monday, I begin this journey welcoming the government's moves to change part of our criminal records regime, part of the DBS check. This traps people in unemployment, it traps them in crime, because of course you have to always reveal your record long after you've served your time, long after you've reformed in that area as well.
Mr. Lammy, time has gone ever so quickly, but is there anything that can go upstream? So for example, someone has made mention of the curriculum, and so there is, lots of discussion around the curriculum in the community, but certainly in prison, in terms of looking at the community that is an inclusive one. And what is it that the government can do? I know that Labour is not is not leading at the moment. However, it's a cross-party report. And so is there some kind of hope really to look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this goes into areas that I wasn't able to deep dive in my review, but I have got views on it as the leader of the opposition in justice areas. Look, I think that we have made progress on basic skills in our prison system, on certification and skill recognition in our prison, whether it's level 1, level 2 and beyond. We haven't always made the proper connections to employment and to the sort of quality standards that exist currently in the workplace. I think that there are real issues with the criminal records regime, as I've suggested. I think there also are real issues in our system for prisoners once they leave prison and enter back into the community. The system is not generous any longer around adult learning. Our FE colleges are really for under 18s, under 21s. There are issues with apprenticeships. So how do you continue that educational journey? How do you get that bespoke response that really cares about the quality of your learning once you've left the prison setting? How do you get those breaks in employment when the onus is so high in terms of employees' reluctance really to take on prisoners and the burden of reporting, even where frankly it's not relevant to the job that you're applying for? These are areas that require real reform, it seems to me. But of course, look, I would be being naive, particularly with this audience, if I said it was just around education. There are real issues in housing and homelessness. for some of the complex problems that we have around knife crime and gang activity particularly, and indeed for some terrorist offences or terrorist related offences. There are real issues in going back to the neighbourhoods that you are from, how we're better, frankly, at something much more like the American system, where prisoners are able to start life out in a very different setting from the one that they grew up in, so they can really turn, particularly if they're, you know, sometimes they're revealing information, they don't want to go back into the same gang context. I think the system's going to get better for people to have those genuine second chances. So sometimes you can get the second chances in prison. Jesus, the resilience that's required to succeed when you get back into the community, it's expecting a hell of a lot, and therefore the recidivism rates are what frankly they have become, which is very, very worrying.
So, Mr. Lammy, the time goes so quickly and it's actually sped by. But I look forward to having another conversation where this group can actually feed back to you to say what we have done differently to support people that are going through the system, those disproportionate numbers. I realize you weren't able to touch on the police, but those prisoners from BAME backgrounds and others just having more of a positive experience because they've been in the system where people actually care and will try and make a difference. So hopefully same time, same place next year, where we can give you some feedback. And I hope you're able to influence some change and get some people to move forward with implementing those recommendations. But on behalf of the Prisoners Education Trust now, I have to say thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Well, look, thank you very much. I have seen some of the questions coming in, so I'm sorry that they haven't all touched on those observations, but I'm very, very grateful to join you. Look, it's tough out there. It's very tough out there, and we're going to go into tough economic times. But, you know, this is an area where the work you do can and does make a huge difference. I know you're up against it. It's really challenging, but can and does make a huge difference. And I recognize, of course, and you know this, that some of these issues and the issues that come out of my review absolutely relate to the systemic institutional issues that arise as a result of Black Lives Matter. They're deeper issues that our society here is still wrestling with, and there are some who don't want to hear. But I am inspired, and I just want to say this, I'm inspired by the millennials, I'm inspired by Generation Y, younger people, black and white, who get this stuff, who want to change this stuff, who will change this stuff. And I think that prison education, work within prisons is a meaningful area. And I suppose as a politician, I also know that it's a public policy area ripe for more change. And I suspect over this next while, as resources are tight and issues are tight in communities, we can either bloat our prison population or we can get to grips with this stuff. And I hope to play my role in really getting to grips with it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lammy. We'll definitely be in touch with you on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've had Honourable Mr. David Lammy, but now I'd like you to introduce our next panel member, and that is Dr. Karen Graham, who I'm just going to read her bio for her. And so Karen Graham is Senior Lecturer in the Faculty of Education at Manchester Metropolitan University. Karen's a former prison teacher and sociologist. She's interested in the ways that systems of education create and maintain persistent inequalities and the particular effect of this on men who go to prison. She's also interested in the ideological and political ways that schools and prisons are used to manage the adult working population. Hello, Karen, and 10 minutes is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Angela. As Angela said, I'm a former prison teacher and I'm currently a senior lecturer in education. I've also worked in other universities in other disciplines, and I've worked in FE, and I've done some work with children in a Saturday school. I say all of that to say that I strongly agree with and promote the transformational power, the potential transformational power of education. But also, and what I'm going to talk about instead today, is the different side of the power of education, and that is the power to marginalise and to exclude and to actually limit opportunities. So my research is kind of going under the umbrella of what David Lammy began to refer to of the pipelines into prison, and specifically the school to prison pipeline. How I came to start thinking about this was through my observations that I made whilst working as a professional teaching in prisons, and noticing that men I spoke to in that capacity often referred to their educational experiences as opposed to the outcomes that they received from education. So as opposed to the qualifications they received or didn't receive, they spoke about their experiences, and these were overwhelmingly negative experiences. Figures show this to be the case. So research conducted by the Ministry of Justice shows that almost 2/3, 63% of prisoners have been subject to temporary school exclusions as an example of negative educational experiences. And for some context, less than 1% of the entire school population have been permanently excluded, whereas in the prison population, 42% of people in the prison population have been permanently excluded from school. And when we consider race within those exclusion statistics, Black Caribbean pupils are permanently excluded at around 3 times the rate of white British pupils, and across the broad ethnic groups, again David Lammy mentioned earlier, Roma Gypsy populations who have the highest proportion of school exclusion, but then broadly Black and mixed ethnicity pupils have the highest rate of both temporary and permanent exclusions. So there is kind of statistical evidence that there is a similar disproportionality and negative experience in education systems prior to prison that mirror and parallel the kind of issues that have been highlighted through the Lammy review and previous similar reviews. I began to focus, instead though of focusing on how education might be used to remedy some of these problems, I began to focus on how education itself might be causing these problems. So, as I say, rather than seeing as education as a kind of positive antidote to some of the problems that might be thought of as existing or rooted outside of education systems, such as families, communities, geographic areas, poverty, we might consider that actually there's something going on in schools of themselves that is contributing to this problem. So to explore this further, I conducted a number of life history interviews with former prisoners, and some themes came across those interviews around what appeared to be a very shared, but on the other hand, unique experience of schooling for men that go to prison. I'm going to share with you a little bit of that research now in the time that I have. So the interviews that I conducted did not ask the men specific questions, so I didn't frame the interviews in considering what I thought might be the interesting or what are the links between your school experiences and how you come to be in prison, but instead just asked them to tell me the story of your schooling. And that story typically, despite the diversity of the men that I interviewed, typically started with being identified as problematic very, very early in their schooling. So in primary schooling, entering schooling, and very early on, being identified by professionals, teachers or head teachers as potentially problematic. And this appeared to be quite arbitrary in the sense that the ways in which people were identified as problematic were quite subjective. They were constructed along the lines that we might be familiar with in terms of perceived dangerousness or perceived threat, or suspicion. So rather than direct evidence of behavioural infractions, teachers were seeking to find out who were going to be the problem pupils in a new cohort entering school, in order that they could make sure that they manage that behaviour. Something that teachers are taught to do. They're trained to do this because they perceive it to be a problem. And how this is done, much in the way that stop and search is conducted, and the other different differences in the way Black people can experience decisions at court level and in prisons, as has been highlighted in the review. These can often be racialised in ways to associate Black cultures and even Black bodies and Black physical deportment as threatening, problematic, aggressive, anti-authoritarian. And so children were finding themselves labelled as problematic when actually they hadn't yet done anything. That then started a kind of chain reaction of negative relationships with teachers, potentially other pupils, a move to different physical spaces that were outside of the mainstream. So rather than being, so it might start with being moved to the back of a classroom, then being moved outside of a classroom, then into an isolation room, and ultimately quite often being excluded from school altogether. Alongside these acts of physical isolation were also frequent examples of educational exclusion. So this is where decisions were made that totally disregarded the acknowledged academic ability of the pupils. So people would be moved down to lower ability sets and told that this was because of their behaviour. And so those opportunities that are in the school to obtain a qualification or obtain knowledge were limited on the basis of a labelling of a pupil as particularly problematic. Interestingly, across the men's stories, quite often there was a narrative of perceived or ever-present possible violence, and this often started when educational exclusion began. So when the men's education started to fall back as a result of being moved out of spaces of meaningful education, they were at threat of being teased by other pupils, and they were kind of falling down the educational hierarchy that exists in schools. And as a result of that, it was often a reaction to kind of lash out and resist that, which obviously created further problems. It exacerbated the problems that were happening in schools, because once you start becoming physical, it creates an issue. But also it had a dual purpose, because whilst it furthered the marginalisation within the school system, it offered an alternative positive status, because the educational status was not available. So there was a status of being tough, of being respected, at least for being able to handle their own business physically. So here we see another example of a kind of ongoing trajectory that is leading in a way that isn't positive. All of the men that I spoke to during my research, and actually in my practice as a prison educator, often talked about trying to extricate themselves from this kind of conveyor belt. So whilst they were at school, they often say, you know, I tried when I started a new school or I started a new year, I tried as hard as I could not to fall back into the same pattern, but it seemed very difficult. It was kind of entrenched. Their peer networks were restricted to other people similarly placed. And so ultimately, my research argues that actually the experience, so school exclusion is awful, lack of qualifications is awful, but the actual experience around that when we explore it is actually incredibly traumatic. And it also gives the children involved a sense of what their potential future possible selves could be, and it's quite limiting. So just to finish, I would suggest those of you who are on this call, regardless of your position, whether it's prison education, prison policy, when we think about education as being a panacea to some of these problems, are we considering, just as David Lammy highlighted, the trauma that education has done to the people that are in front of you in the first place? And if you don't, you are possibly at risk of re-traumatizing by potentially trying to do the same thing over again in a prison classroom. Sit still, do as I say, you know, kind of revisiting the same experiences they had. To consider more critically the role of education in people's lives. Yes, it has the power to transform, but used in a way often for people that come to prison, it has had the opposite effect, and we really need to seriously consider that when we're planning any activity we do around prison education.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. There is a journey. People don't just arrive in prison, and you're perfectly right. The experience that young people have in schools, if they've been excluded and they go into a prison environment, education might not be the place they want to go because of those negative experiences. Just to point out, Karen, that people are interested in your publications. So if you can maybe stick that in the chat. Everyone, please do send in your Q&A, which we will be asking the panel in a while. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, and that's Dr. Anthony Gunter. He's a program leader and senior lecturer in childhood and youth studies at the Open University. Prior to his career in academia, Anthony worked for over 14 years in both South and East London within a variety of community settings as a detached community and youth worker and project area manager. His current research explores contemporary urban youth cultures and alternative youth transitions, serious youth violence, and the street gang. He's the author of Race, Gangs and Youth Violence, Policy, Prevention and Policing. So over to you, please, Dr. Gunter. Thank you. You're on mute, by the way. You have to unmute yourself.
Apologies. All right, thank you, Angela. We got there in the end. Right, following on from Karen, I think my talk kind of like follows on very, very nicely, actually. I think for us, you know, I'm a great cricket fan. I was a cricket fan, and I remember watching Michael Holding's talk, and when he was told to give his opinion on the Black Lives Matter movement.
Oh, yeah.
He took it out of the realms of cricket and the present and actually put it in a really longer historical context. And for me, today I'm going to say why young Black lives still do not matter. And you know, you yourselves as prison educators, I think you need to understand why this is still happening. And you know, you can do some brilliant work, but in many respects, the system is almost like frustrating individual acts of brilliant work. And we need to put the current situation in 500 years of history, let's be honest. And then narrow that history down to the past 100 years with regards to the United Kingdom. And it's interesting that today we've been talking about, you know, young people from traveller communities. I know we talk about Muslim youth after this, but there has been a particular issue of the past 100 or so years in the UK about poorer working class white children, white young people. We then come to the 1950s with the Windrush situation, and we're talking about linking that question of muds, rockers, teddy boys and so forth, pickpockets, with immigration. And if we then, you know, look at all of this, it's created a quiet storm where we now have 51% of our young men are in prison. But you know, we didn't just happen to get here by accident. You know, it's something that's been a long time in the making. And in particular, the issue of race and immigration, happened with regards to policing and using crime statistics in the 1970s to almost justify Enoch Powell's arguments about rivers of blood, and if you have, Pickaninnies, and if you let these non-white immigrants into the country, it's not a case of just keeping them out. They're going to have children. And what he was actually saying is these children are going to be a problem. And so he got shouted down in some quarters as a racist. But in many other quarters, there's been, in my opinion, this quiet revolution to make sure that Enoch Powell's foreboding has come to pass. And there's a reason for this, which we'll talk about. So if we talk about the role of the police and the media, and this whole, David Lammy talked about gangs, exploitation, and knife crime, and it almost makes my heart sink, because how can you address this particular problem about disproportionality and punishment if we keep carrying on the black folk devil and the Muslim folk devil, which I'm sure we talked about after. We have stories like Britain's knife crime epidemic, London murder rate overtakes New York's, London crime epidemic, ex-Met cop warns about stabbings and shootings. They can happen anywhere. So you've got this gangs crisis that we need to be aware of. And then on top of that, we've moved away from the gangs crisis to then talk about county lines and exploitation. Now you might argue, yes, these things are real, young people have been exploited, but if they are exploited, surely they're victims. Victims don't end up getting longer stretches than they need to. Victims get support, they get intervention, they get therapy, education works for them. But this isn't the case for if you happen to be black and Asian and marginal ethnic, and you happen to be caught up in this county line situation. So, we need to be careful about the statistics that have been used. We need to be careful about the way the police are justifying their behaviour, which they have over the past 30 to 40 years. So, we have to look at, why this is happening and what we can do to change it. So the reworking of the gang, the county lines, you've basically got pictures. I had pictures and I'll share them with you. And when they show these pictures, and they are also colleagues, white colleagues in the academic community who are part of what I call the gang industry, they do research to demonstrate that young black men are disproportionately involved in this sort of crime. So it happens that we have newspapers or we have news items whereby young black men, we can see them with their trainers, we can see them with their designer jeans, we can see young black men in designer t-shirts with their bling, with their hair plaited up. Then, these are, people who are bad people, they're not good people. But my only argument to this is, young people, are not part of the organised crime situation. The organised crime networks are sort of, they mirror the white institutions of power. So black young men on the streets do not import tons of drugs. They do not import knives. They do not control, illegal, illicit underground drug economy. But yet, research, police statistics, media will make us believe that they are the most important group of criminals. And why does this why is this the case? Why are we having headlines about 4,000 teenagers from London being exploited, but yet when the police are sort of harassing Dawn Butler, the MP, when the Metropolitan Police chiefs are asked why this is the case, they will say, well, because disproportionately crime is happening in black communities. Well, Dawn is a middle-aged politician. She does not wear trainers. She does not wear a hoodie. She's not got bling. So why is she being stopped in her car with her colleagues? So it doesn't add up. But the justification for this treatment is premised on this idea that black people pose more of a risk, more of a threat than anyone else. So we can shut down any criticisms of an unjust and disproportionately impactful criminal justice system. So it comes to disproportionality with regards to stop and search, deaths in custody, you know, the prison estate, all of these things. But they don't just happen by accident. You know, the police feel justified to stop more black young people or older black people because in their mind, they are up to no good. They are a criminal community. But there's no context of the communities and the difficulties that these communities are facing. You know, the Windrush scandal, you know, austerity, you know, disbanded connection service, educational maintenance allowances, you know, child and family support services, massive cuts to benefits. So, you know, all these things, you know, are impacting upon these communities. But at the same time, they are being criminalized and pushed through into our criminal justice system for a reason, you know, we can actually say. So if, you know, before I come to tie this up, it comes back to the Netflix documentary, When They See Us. And, you know, it's about the fear of a black body, male body, which goes back hundreds of years. It goes back to the plantation system with the overseer who was making sure that the slave, you know, did not, you know, try to escape, was worked too much, you know. It then comes to colonial policing after the ending of slavery, allegedly, whereby, you know, the Metropolitan Police were set up to basically police with consent. They police white communities with consent. They don't police BME communities with consent. So in terms of the post-Windrush period of the 1950s, going to 70s and 80s, we see the policing internal colonies of black settlement in places like Brixton in London, Handsworth in Birmingham, St. Paul's in Bristol. And it then comes back to what I said, the re-articulation of the issue of race and immigration, which we're seeing with Brexit, and we're seeing with these boatloads of immigrants who we're saying we don't want here, because if they come here, there'll be a problem. But the answer to it seems to be criminalize them and put them in prison, just like it's happened in America. So we can see the convergence between immigration, crime, and terror, and ultimately the fact that Enoch is right. So it comes back down to solutions. What are the solutions? Firstly and foremostly, we have to acknowledge that, you know, it's not an accident why we find ourselves in this position. We have to be honest and have real honest conversations about moving forward and saying, you know what, we have to start from scratch. We have to acknowledge that we do see certain groups more problematic than others. So, you know, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gunter, for quite a provocative presentation. There are some questions I hope will be coming through for you. People seem to be quite shy at the moment. Please do put your questions in, because there will be an opportunity to actually ask some questions of our panelists afterwards. Society, the media, all very interesting. Colonialism. So last but not least, our last presenter today is Raheel Muhammad, who is the director and founder of Maslaha, and has been named as one of Britain's 50 new radicals by the Observer newspaper and Nesta. Under his direction, Maslaha created long-term interventions tackling inequalities faced by Muslim communities in areas such as health, education, gender inequality, the criminal justice system, and negative public narratives. Raheel currently sits on an advisory board to the Ministry of Justice, looking at the disproportionate number of young Muslim men in the criminal justice system following the launch of the Young Review and the Lammy Review. Raheel is also the co-producer and presenter of the podcast I'd Like to Believe, which explores the disproportionate rise of Muslims in the prison system. So over to you, please, Raheel.
Hi, thanks, Angela, and hello to everyone. I've got some slides. Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about how the identity of being Muslim is now seen through the lens of risk, and how that can lead to dehumanizing behavior, and how that is linked to how knowledge is produced and by who. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to start with Toni Morrison. In 1975, Toni Morrison is giving a talk in Portland, and this is how she begins. Right after pitch and rice, but after tar and turpentine, there is listed the human being. The rice is measured by pounds, and the tar and the turpentine is measured by barrel weight. Now, there was no way for the book entitled The Historical Statistics of the United States from Colonial Times to measure by pound or tonnage or barrel weight the human beings. They used only head count. She goes on to say there was a difference, apparently, between the number shipped and the number that actually arrived. And then one thinks about the next question, the really vital question that withers all of the others. Who? Who was absent at the final head count? Was there a 17-year-old girl there with a tree-shaped scar on her knee? And what was her name? And what's important in that piece is that Toni Morrison makes the point that the nature of history likes to make large distinctions to the detriment of the finer ones. But she goes on to make the point that it's the ability to make distinctions, and the smaller the distinctions made, the higher the intellect. And it's these finer distinctions that are often missing from our work looking at the experience of Muslims in the prison system. And it's something that we try to capture through our report, Time to End the Silence, which we can put a link to in the chat room. And we did this through the lens of vital services. So we looked at education, we looked at mental health, we looked at family support. And this matters because, as the Lammy Review pointed out 3 years ago, the number of Muslims in the prison system has risen dramatically. So it's doubled over the past 16 years to almost 13,500. In 2002, the numbers were around 5,500. And what's really interesting, and the Lammy Review made this point 3 years ago, was that we don't know why this increase has happened. We only know that religion is measured once you're in prison, but there is no data that's collected at courts or collected by the CPS. And it begs the question, why? Is it because there isn't enough expertise or skills, or is it because these communities don't matter? Our report found that marginalised communities and Muslim communities in the context of this work are often decontextualised from their environment, from their culture, their religion, their heritage, their history, the political and social context. But it's this very decontextualising that actually has a dehumanising effect on those communities. And one of the kind of main points that we found was this real disparity between how Muslim men and women that we spoke to saw religion and Islam as an anchor and support, but how it was viewed through suspicion by the prison system. Can we go to the next report, please? Sorry, the next slide. So this is a page from the Chief Inspector of Prison reports. And you can see at the top there, there's columns for black and minority ethnic men, white men, Muslim men, and non-Muslim men. And then down the left-hand side, there are different indicators in terms of relationships with staff, faith, contact with family, friends. Now, the blue colour shows significantly more negative experiences than the comparator. I think the comparator is a polite way of saying white people in prison. So if we look, we can see that there's a huge number of blues coming up against black and brown people and Muslim people. So if you're asked the question, do most staff here treat you with respect? Negative experience. Are there any staff here you could turn to if you had a problem? Negative. In the last week, has any member of staff talked to you about how you're getting on? Negative. Is your personal or named officer very or quite helpful? Negative. Are your religious beliefs respected here? Negative. And this is an example of what Toni Morrison was talking about, the kind of larger historical distinctions. And if we can now go to the next slide and play the clip. And this, for me, is the kind of finer detail that's missing.
I'd like to believe every cautionary tale my mama told me harboured a lie. I'd like to believe that our solitary prayers sing softness into our hearts, not concrete.
Praying 5 times a day in congregation is normal, and it happens every day of the year, all up and down the country, all over the world. But when it happens in a prison environment and you've got a bunch of Muslim lads in one cell, it starts sending off alarms in the prison staff, like what are they up to, what's going on.
I'd like to believe you're aware that only radicalism on this day is comfort's love.
Officers might think, these guys are getting radicalized. Oh, how come one day he's normal, now he's got a beard? Oh, look, he's praying now, he's preaching, you get me?
I'd like to believe I'll never have to feel the weight of truncheons ready to make baseball of my back in Sujood.
There is, I think, a big public misconception that a majority of the Muslims in prison are there for radicalisation-related offences, and they're not. It's a very, very, very small minority.
Like, we've been in situations where there's not a valid reason, not like an incident has not happened, but they've split us up completely. And they just say to us in our face, there's too many of you lot.
It's not that individuals are innocent or not, it's who becomes criminalised or not. And what we'll see is invariably that black and brown people are more likely to be criminalised. It's no surprise, therefore, that over the last 10 years, the Muslim prison population has doubled. Doubled. Nobody can convince me that offending behaviour and criminal behaviour within the Muslim community has doubled over the last 10 years. Yeah, I will challenge you to the hilt on that.
I'd like to believe you're aware that only radicalism on this day is comfort's love.
When you go to Friday prayers, me personally, that day, I'm all happy, all smiles.
I'd like to believe on Fridays, when the mandem kiss each other's cheeks and embrace like we're back in the arms of our mothers, that you do not fear the tension that rolls off my back with every salam.
You've seen your mates from across the other side of the jail, you're happy, you know they're good, they know you're good, you're happy, you can walk back with a smile, your brothers, your cousins, everyone knows you're good.
Blessed day.
Can we go to the next slide?
I'd like to believe...
Thank you. So there are more stories in our report. There are stories of Qurans and prayer mats being desecrated, Muslims in prison being questioned about why they want to access the listener scheme for mental health. Every single Muslim man that we spoke to in prison spoke about how the threat of not being allowed to go to Friday prayers was used against them as a form of control, as a form of punishment. So those finer details really do matter. This normalization of violence these stories don't spill out. They're kind of held because it's seen as normal. And we see something similar happening, I think, within schools and within bureaucracy and within administration. So something that's become really clear within the prison system is how Muslims are written up. And academics like Alison Liebling have spoken about this as well. It's kind of writing up of the most kind of innocent actions. And how this happens within schools, and it happens in other sectors as well, is through the prevent policy. So the prevent policy became a legal duty in 2015. It's a way of trying to spot signs of radicalization, but it operates in the kind of pre-criminal space. And importantly, it's part of safeguarding as well. So to give you an example of the kind of impact it's had, in 1 year, from 2015 to 2016, around 1,500 Muslim children under the age of 15 were referred through this counter-terrorism policy. Only about 100 were taken further, and we don't really know what that means, taken further. But that means that 1,400 Muslim parents or carers received a phone call to say, we think your child is being harmed, and we think that you're complicit. Now, if this had been white middle-class children, there would have been an uproar, but there isn't. And what the data hides is the impact that this has on parents and carers. So I've spoken to a mum whose child was in primary school, and the child was, thank you, Angela, the child was dared to draw a gun. And so he did, and based on that, he was referred. And this parent then carried around this stigma of feeling that she had done something wrong. And she was very much part of the school community and school life. And what this leads to is that communities then begin to censor themselves. So parents, for instance, have said to us that they would deliberately not have certain conversations at home because they're worried about how those conversations might then play out within the school environment. Equally, Muslims in prison have said to us that they will hide their Muslimness because they're afraid of how that might be recorded. I'm going to just end on the flow of information, and just to say that it's really important to understand who creates this information and how. The analysis cannot be crude, it has to be more sophisticated. And if it is more sophisticated, it's more compassionate, because there isn't really such a thing as neutral analysis or neutral research. That neutrality can also exacerbate harm and systemic racism. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Raheel. And all panelists, if you'd like to take your microphones off mute, I'm going to ask a couple of the questions that have come up. If you've got any further questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'm not very good at looking at both places, and I don't think when they asked me to do this, they knew that. So there is an important question, because we tend to, and I often tend to talk about males because I spent a lot of my time working in male institutions. But what about females within the system? And also in terms of county lines, Dr. Gunter, there is quite a lot of work that's been done for women that are disadvantaged, but we do tend to focus on males. So on females, Karen, Dr. Karen Graham, why is it so easy for exclusions to take place? And Raheel, what is it that we can practically do within the classroom to make a difference? Okay, so over to you. Anthony, then Karen and Raheel.
Okay, going back to the county lines thing, and also young women, I mean, I think for me there's a bit of a balance, because I've always found that black young women are the forgotten party, always have been. Yeah. But because they don't represent an immediate risk, they almost forgotten about and pushed down the pile. But what I don't want to do is to get them on the agenda to start seeing them as a problem. So I think we need to focus on the needs of young women, but not from a negative. I want to look at it from a positive. What can we do to support young women? And in doing that, we're supporting black communities and neighborhoods. So I think not enough is known. I mean, one of my PhD students has done some work with young women on road, in gangs, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of those young women have agency. They're not just victims. You know, they're doing stuff to survive. But there's a balance of we don't want to see them, disproportionately in prison. They are already, but we don't be adding to them more in prison. So for me, I think we shouldn't. So what I'm saying is we're focusing on young black men negatively at the expense of our women, of our young women. Mm-hmm. I think we need to be focusing on our young people in a constructive, positive way, in terms of what can we do to give them the life opportunities and life chances. And not from a criminal perspective for men, and it's going to be a victim perspective for the young women, but from a holistic, supportive, why can't our black young people reach their potential and be seen to have potential? And we don't want to give them any more chips on their shoulders. We want to give them faith and hope and the tools and support to go on and do well.
And if I might add that a large number of our young people are doing exceptionally well, but the focus always does tend to be on the negative. I know that there's an organisation, Abianda, that focuses, and there are others that focuses on supporting young women, where they're empowering them. However, they are victims as well, and they're part of that. We obviously need to look at solutions for all of our young people, as you say, but also promote the good stuff when things do turn around. So why is it so easy, Karen? Why is exclusion, like the process, such an easy one?
I think there's a couple of levels to this. First of all, in the current moment, we're in an education system that's highly marketised and highly competitive and run in a particular kind of way where, you know, with academies, etc., there isn't so much oversight in terms of exclusion procedures. People can, you know, head teachers can decide to exclude at will, and will be keen to do that if it improves their figures or improves their market position, etc. But on a deeper level, and this probably has existed for as long as education systems have existed, so prior to the marketisation of education that we experience at the moment, that one of the functions of education is to sort people into a hierarchy of who is the best and who's the middle and who's the worst. And public and policy approaches to this are that really what we should be doing education is a public good, and we need to be trying to get as many people to standard as possible. And if there's a perception that there are some children who are getting away in the way of that process, for the one, then it's completely legitimate to remove those children, because although there's an acknowledgement that those children don't benefit from it, what it does is benefit the rest of the system. So it benefits children that are left in the classroom or in the school, which makes it quite an easy sell, because it's, you know, if only these children behaved, these children misbehaving is causing a problem for the teacher or for the rest of the class, and so it's a very easy sell to remove these children. But as I say, more deeply, it's about having children that can be identified as illegitimate learners, so that they can be at the complete opposite end of the scale to those that are doing exceptionally well. So it serves another function of legitimising the whole hierarchies that we live in generally in society. There are some people that have a lot and they deserve to have that because they did well in school. And there's some people in prison because they messed about at school and then committed crime, and that seems fair. So this is part of a kind of very deep, inherent feature of education that is currently being exacerbated by the kind of market economy as well.
Thank you for that, Karen. And Raheel, there's an interesting question in here from Pretty. I don't know if you can see the Q&As, but she states that today marks the start of the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry, and it's not even been a year since the London Bridge attack. So how can we, if we can at all, think about these events and their perpetrators in the context of prevent profiling, discrimination in the prison system, and demonization of Muslims in mainstream rhetoric? Because that's how Muslims will be associated, as opposed to anything else. And so what can we do? What can we do?
I think we have to be really critical, and I think what tends to happen is that there's a one event that happens, and then we have this quick rush to like try and create policy around that, and it's a really easy response. You know, and as Anthony's mentioned, these are systemic problems going back. So really kind of, you know, sort of like quick, easy fixes. So for instance, you know, I know there's discussion around if we increase the number of black and brown prison officers in prison, that will solve racism. Well, it won't if the prison system is institutionally racist. If we have state-sanctioned racism. We already have mandatory guidelines within the prison system that says, you know, somebody should be allowed to practice their faith. I think it's about everybody educating themselves. And I think that has started to happen. I think both within the charity sector and more widely, but not to be kind of thrown off by, you know, the media is pretty crude. Like their analysis is so poor. And I think it's actually, you know, I think the onus, I think, is on the people around this panel to make our work more widely available and more easily accessible, and for people to search out those answers from other places. But we can't have a situation where we're locking up disproportionately black and brown marginalized people, because the cost of that we're paying. You know, the human harm that's caused, not just to them, to their families, to their communities. And you know, if you don't care about any of that, just in terms of finance, you know, there's been an announcement that there's going to be a number of new prisons built at the cost of 2.5 billion. why not invest that into education and health?
Totally agree. Totally agree. Well, we're coming up to the end of this, and it's been fascinating. Part of me wanted to have been a delegate so I could really take this in, but it's good that we're going to be in touch beyond this, I'd like to think. But so our audience have got the benefit of hearing you giving them some takeaway, because there's no point in having one of these discussions. It sounds good, then we go away. But what is it that individuals can actually take away and utilize going forward, so that if we were to come back here a year on, there will be something that's different. As I say, we can actually lever on the tragedies that have recently occurred, with Black Lives Matter and also the awful murder of George Floyd. So we can actually use that as a lever to make change, have those open discussions, but not just have the talk, but do something. Dr. Gunter, what can we do in a couple of minutes? What is it that people can practically do?
What people can practically do is take their head from out the sands and stop thinking that I can be a great individual. Understand you are part of a system that has oppressed and continues to oppress people. And unless you acknowledge that, we will continue to have more situations that we've got. We'll have 90% of the prison population in 10 years' time, unless we acknowledge that this is built on imperialism, British imperialism, white supremacy. And it is what it is. It sounds radical, but it's built on white supremacy. It's a white supremacy system that allows Black, Asian, Muslim, Indigenous peoples to be at the bottom of the pile. And unless we acknowledge that, we will not go anywhere.
Dr. Gunter, I actually made this comment to Mr. Lammy. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to do it's systemic? How do we do that? And so that's just a question. So one of those key things is about just being able to talk about it, not imagine it's not happening. It's happening now. And we're all responsible. We all have to take some responsibility in making the change happen. So Dr. Graham, I keep interchanging your first names and last names, excuse me. So,
yeah, I would agree with Anthony's comment that to see any meaningful change, I think people really need to educate themselves as to how racism really is operating. And to do that, sometimes it's to get a deeper understanding of what racism is. So, the historic inherent nature of it in systems. And my recommendation, so the thing that helped me the most personally with this, even though I'm a person of colour who's experienced racism all of my life, my recommendation would be to engage with critical race theory. My particular recommendation is Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism. If you read that, it might, once you see it, you might not be able to unsee, and that by its very nature might change your practice or your perspective.
Brilliant. Would you mind just popping that into the chat for us, please, Karen? That'd be really helpful, thank you. And Raheel, what messages would you give that we can do something practical?
So the report that we just produced was in partnership with the Prisons Education Trust, PACT, Samaritans and Switchback. They didn't wait around for 2020 to happen to look at how they ran services and whether or not they were delivering services that were fit for purpose for Black and brown people. And so I think there's an element of organisations, whatever you're doing, and David Lammy spoke about this, if you're in the business of prisons and education, you have to be talking about race. Yeah. And I would sort of like reference Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of race. I'm going to slightly paraphrase it, but she speaks about state-sanctioned racism exploiting group vulnerabilities which lead to premature death. And if that's the one thing that COVID has shown, this thing of like underlying conditions, we always have to ask the question, but why? Why are there underlying conditions? Well, if you live in poverty, poor housing, yeah. If you're excluded, if you don't have jobs, then that's an ecosystem of racism that will eventually mean you live a shorter life and not reach your potential. So I think for everyone, I think that question of how does race fit into what we're doing? Why is it that parents aren't turning up at the school gate? What is it within the school that's preventing that happening? And there's a couple of projects, if I can quickly mention, that we have running with parents and schools. One's called School with Roots, which people can see on our website. And the other project is called Muslim Girls Fence. But those are projects around creating different spaces to actually practically, kind of change this conversation.
There is one quick, because we've still got a couple of minutes, there's one point that hasn't been mentioned, and it's about staff also working within the system. So the same kind of disadvantages, shall we say, that that students or prisoners might face, there are staff within institutions that are also struggling in a not dissimilar way, and actually having to not only try to maneuver through their careers with their difference, or let me just say, actually facing racism. And so it goes right the way across the board. So if I was to give a final encouragement to everyone, as well as looking at our user group, it's also looking at each other and supporting each other and actually listening and hearing. So there's some of the same traumas that our young people are facing, adults are facing too, even within the criminal justice system and working there, which I've done for many years. We've got one minute left, or 2 minutes. I'm such a great chair. But even if I say so myself, one last thing, Dr. Gunter, real quick, just a sentence, something empowering to us all.
We got to be honest, and we've got to go for it now. We've got to work to make it happen.
No, thank you. Dr. Graham.
I think to try and hold the dual problems of we are educators and we know that that can be a power for good, but also understanding how it can be harmful. It's a tricky one, but I would encourage you to try and keep that. Don't be so over optimistic about what education can do. Try and hold the balance, a critical balance between the two.
Brilliant, thank you. And Raheel.
Arundhati Roy was talking about that this moment is a portal right now, and we have about, I would say, 6 to 8 months. So I think, if there's a sense of urgency, like go for it from a strengths-based place. We've survived. Despite everything, we've survived. So our potential is huge.
Absolutely, excellent. Yeah, it gives me great pleasure to thank you guys. I need to be in touch with you all, by the way. I guess that's one of the chairs. That's one of the benefits of being chair. And I want to thank you so much for such an insightful set of presentations that we can actually look at practically to not solve problems, but bring some solution to our practice. I want to thank the audience. There are 217 participants there, no pressure. There were some questions in the Q&A. As I said, this is the first time I've done this, so I may not be asked again because I'm rubbish at looking at both. I tend to like talking to people. I want to say thank you so much to the Prisoners Education Trust for inviting me, maybe the first and last time, to host such a brilliant event. And also, please do get in touch with the Prisoners Education Trust. They need your input, they need your expertise, because we're all working together to make a difference to the communities that we are working to support. We are the difference. If we want to see the change, we are the change. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and please keep safe in these very difficult times. Thank you.